Okay, well, it is time to begin. Today we will talk about Immanuel Kant. Two lectures on Kant this week, one today and the other one on Wednesday. Kant is very important to understand in order to go anywhere closer to our time, because his philosophy is key to this entire modern period. You will not be able to understand very much there without understanding Kant first, and he is really a huge watershed. But at the same time, he is very interesting and very different from a lot of what we talked about before. So it is important to understand him well, and this is the last topic before the exam. Remember that a week from today, yes, on the 9th, we will have our next exam. So when we're done with Kant, that'll be a good time for you guys to start preparing for the exam, and I will again put up the review on Wednesday and so on. And once you're done with the exam, that's when you hopefully can start with an essay, because next week there will be only the exam, right? You know that there's no class on the 11th. November 11th, there's no class. So starting from the day after the exam, you can start working on the essay, put together some ideas and so on. Okay, hopefully the all the craziness with the elections and stuff not going to put us too far off the track. There is some hope that it will all be over on, well, if not tomorrow, then at least next couple of days, but you never know. I guess we will see what happens. Okay, before we get into Kant, a few things that you have to remember, just to get some sort of perspective on Kant, and also it is again important for the upcoming exam. One of them is once again to refresh your memory on who was Copernicus and what did he do. Yes, exactly. So the idea again was that, remember, to people before that, it seemed obvious that we are the center of the universe, right? We are the Earth, and human beings on it are at the very center. And everything else, including the sun, revolves around us, which seemed common sense, isn't it? If you don't know anything about science, if you look at the sky, doesn't it make sense that the sun actually revolves around us? It seems common sense. Most people would agree with that, if not everybody. But Copernicus was the first one who said, wait a minute, that actually is not the best explanation. And if we put the sun at the center and give up that privileged place in nature, we will be able to explain what's going on a little bit better, because that way those weird rotations the planet are making, the loops, will get an explanation. So you will see that Kant is actually comparing himself to Copernicus, and hopefully you will understand why when we talk about it. Now, what according to Hume is the basis of causal judgments, and what specifically is missing there in our understanding of the causal judgment? Impression. What do you mean impression? Now, how do we understand causal judgments? If we say one thing causes the other, what is necessary in order for us to make this determination? Well, relations and ideas and matters of fact is kind of two different issues. I don't think that this is something to mention in that relation. Okay, let me, there's actually a slide here which refreshes your memory from last time. Okay, this is what he says. This is what we base it on. Contiguity of two events in space. So two events should be somehow spatially connected, right? If we're saying that one billiard ball hits the other billiard ball Well, they better actually physically touch each other, right? You can't do it from a distance. If you have two balls on two different sides of the table, one of them will never be able to move the other one. They have to get together. Number 2 is priority in time. So one event has to happen before the other one. First one ball starts moving, then it hits the other ball. It cannot happen any other way. Third thing is constant conjunction, meaning it should be happening every single time we see it. If it doesn't, if sometimes it does happen, sometimes it does not, then you really can't say that they are causally connected. If one time the ball hits the other and the ball doesn't move, the other time it hits the other and it moves, then you may wonder whether it moves for some other reason than, that other ball. Maybe there's some sort of internal movement, or maybe the table is tilting, or I don't know what. But you would certainly have to find another explanation. But if it happens every single time, then you have good reason to believe that. And finally, according to Hume, there is one more thing, which we actually, according to him, do not have. And this is necessary connection. What does he mean by that? Well, it seems sometimes a little difficult to understand, but the point he is making is this. When we say 2 plus 2 equal 4, we have this necessary logical connection because we cannot imagine it to be any other way. There is like a strict necessity there. But when we talk about events, one event causing the other, that never is like that. Hume tells us, well, we see one thing follow the other, but we can't possibly say that there is this necessary, some sort of necessity, which makes it definitely the case. And gravity was one example we talked about, and this is a good example. So again, if I let go of this marker, it will fall every single time, and I let go and it falls once again. But is there any necessity to that? Is there any way you can say, oh, it's impossible for it not to fall? It will never happen. Not really, because if it doesn't fall, if it somehow I let it go and it flies up in space, well, you'd be surprised, but it's not going to be like 2 plus 2 equals 5, is it? It's something more like, whoa, that is weird. And nonetheless, it is possible. So he's saying that necessary connection is actually missing. It's not there. So how does he actually explain it? What does he say is the base we really base our belief in causal relation on instead of the necessity? Habit, exactly. He's saying it's habitual. We see it happen all the time, so we say, okay, it will continue happening because it's been happening before. And that's it, all there is to it. And what was Hume's view on substances? Yeah, they don't exist. That basically is his view. Prior to him, remember that Descartes said that there are mental and spiritual, physical substances. Then Berkeley said that, well, there's actually no physical substances, but there are mental ones. And finally, Hume says, actually, there is no physical and no mental substances. In fact, there are no substances whatsoever. We are just making them up. No, Julia, you are actually wrong. All in our head, I saw this part and I kind of didn't see the other one. No, it's not all mental. It's Berkeley was saying it's all mental. To Hume, it simply doesn't exist. It's the phantom of our imagination. To say that it's mental, you basically are saying that it does exist, but in kind of mental capacity. But Hume was saying that basically we have no basis to imagine for it to exist in any kind of capacity. Okay, so now getting to Immanuel Kant. Who was Immanuel Kant? Where did he live? He was born in Königsberg, East Prussia, on April 22nd, 1724, almost exactly 300 years ago. Went to University of Königsberg, ended up having his entire career related to the University of Königsberg, became professor there, lectured there, By the way, the city of Königsberg, well, Julia may know where it is. It used to be East Prussia, it used to be part of Germany, but it no longer is. So what happened to it? After World War II, that entire territory was taken by Russia. Now it's part of Russian Federation. There's no longer any German people who live there, and it's no longer part of Germany, and it's no longer called Königsberg either. It's called Kaliningrad, and there's a little bit of the old Königsberg left, but almost nothing. They built the entirely new city there, and there's no German people. So today it is very different, but back then it was still part of Germany, and Immanuel Kant spent his entire life in that city. He never left it. He never traveled anywhere. He never held any family. He did not do anything other than his philosophy. Kind of a rather boring life in that sense. Would be very boring if it wasn't for the philosophy itself, which is rather revolutionary and amazing. Also, he was a very knowledgeable person. He was teaching many subjects in his professional capacity, not just metaphysics, but logic, ethics, aesthetics, philosophical theology, mathematics, physics, geography, and anthropology. So he actually had a very, very good background in sciences, in what today we would call hard science, not just in philosophy. And finally, he kind of retired in 1789 and died February 12, 1804. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the reading. That actually, like, I used to give students the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason itself, but this work is supposedly supposed to be a little bit easier than the critique, because he wrote it after the critique, and the idea was to make it more approachable to a regular person, because after it was first printed, his critique of pure reason was largely misunderstood, and some students, some people just couldn't read the entire thing at all, and the ones who didn't understand it. So he tried to make it a little bit easier for a common person, and well, hopefully it worked, but I'm not sure, because again, his ideas and the way he describes them may seem a little bit hard to understand. But did you guys understand any of it, and what exactly did you think about the reading? Well, did you get anything out of it? What was going on? What's his project? What is he trying to do there? He kind of starts talking about it rather early on, and in a more or less human language. Yeah, he brings Hume there right away and says that that's actually one of the goals, is to answer Hume, because like I said, Hume did cause him to react in this way, but why? What specifically is he addressing? Yes, causation, but what about it? So what is his beef with Hume? Note that again, what was Hume saying? Hume was saying that there's no really necessity there, and necessity we just add. But Kant kind of disagrees with that in a sense, but not in a way you would expect him to disagree. Note that the divide between rationalists and empiricists prior to Kant was this. Rationalists was saying there are some ideas pre-installed in the mind and we actually can understand them. Remember, Descartes was saying the idea of God. The idea of God is already there, and so on. Whereas empiricists were saying, including Hume, that no, we get everything from experience. So that's essentially one of the reasons why Kant felt like there's something needs to be done, because if you follow down that path the way Hume did, you get to the complete skepticism. You're basically saying you cannot know anything at all. And that is what he is trying to answer. He is trying to address the topic of, and specifically what? Metaphysics, right? What was he saying about metaphysics there? Is he saying metaphysics was doing really well? No. He is actually saying it is in complete disaster. What is going on with metaphysics is a shame. Because why? Well, we every time we try to do metaphysics, what is happening? Yeah, it doesn't depend on experience, of course. How can you depend on experience? Remember, they were trying to kind of prove the fact that God exists based on experience, but that it doesn't seem to work very well. And Hume was right about his criticism. So essentially, metaphysics was kind of getting more and more banished from serious consideration. It was slowly becoming that there is like religion, theology done in church, right? But in philosophy, that was becoming less and less possible to seriously take any of that stuff. And yet it creates the problem. What problem it creates? Well, in particular, one big problem which we are facing, and which is right at the stake here, is the problem of freedom of the will. The good old problem of the freedom of the will. Because note that the cause and effect is very closely connected to this problem. What is the problem? The problem is science tells us everything has a cause. Things do not happen for no reason, right? But how is it then possible to have freedom of the will if everything has a cause? So everything is determined according to the laws of nature. So if somebody murdered somebody, he can tell you, oh, I'm sorry, it's the laws of nature. It's all those particles, the particles and the laws. They have interacted and made me do that. You can't blame me. How can you blame me? It's physics, man. I'm not guilty of anything. I could not resist the particles and the laws of nature. It's all determined. So then that means we can't blame anybody for any evil act, and we also cannot praise anybody for any good act. Because again, that's just all determined. But what's the problem with this approach? It seems to go directly against common sense, doesn't it? I mean, I can't even imagine how could we do that. So essentially, and for all of us, like for example, if you fail something, you would have to say, well, it was just determined that I will fail it. On the other hand, if you achieved something, you can say, well, big deal. It was determined that I will achieve that. But it seems like if you take this attitude, you actually wouldn't achieve very much, would you? So there seems to be some sort of a contradiction here. And that is exactly the essence of the problem he's trying to address. How can you reconcile human freedom and science and physics and the laws of nature? Can you? That is the purpose of the entire enterprise. Okay, he's talking about avoiding dogmatism and skepticism in the critique. He don't think he does go into that in the reading you guys did. Nonetheless, it is important to him because he himself began with rationalism, and then he considered that position to be dogmatic. What does that mean? Well, he's saying dogmatic position is when you do not critically assess something and just say, well, this is how things are, without questioning that, without scrutiny. That would be dogmatic approach. Dogmatic approach would be, well, a lot of what you see in terms of like metaphysics prior to this point would be, according to Kant, very dogmatic. When you start talking about how life after death works, how God works, and so on, without finding any kind of foundation for that stuff, that's just pure fantasy. And so you're being dogmatic when you are trying to affirm these things without proper proofs, without some sort of reasoning, good reasoning behind it. On the other hand, there's skepticism. And that's another extreme, because you can go too far in terms of criticizing stuff. Instead of affirming it without proper critique, you can criticize it to the point when you doubt everything, including your own existence. So that would be another problem to avoid. There has to be some way in between them. You have to be critical, but not to the critical to the point when you doubt everything there is whatsoever. So he again was trying to base everything on science. He was well familiar with the work of Newton, with Newton's physics, with latest advances in mathematics, and so on, and he was firmly believing in science. Nonetheless, he thought that there is some truth to some of the rationalist assumptions as well. And there is some truth to empiricism, to empiricist approach. Everything kind of makes sense to a certain degree. You just have to put it together correctly. So 3 main goals he was trying to solve in his critique. First of all, develop a new understanding of knowledge which combines both of these approaches, empiricist and rationalist approach. Second of all, reconcile religion, morality, and human freedom with science. He thought that there has to be a way, and he thinks that he found that way to explain all these things without either falling into this kind of crazy skepticism or into some sort of fantasy land. They're making things up out of nothing. And finally, to solve thereby the crisis of metaphysics, and to show that metaphysics can be done. It's just that you have to approach it in the right way. Dogmatism, again, according to Kant, is the presumption of getting on solely with pure cognition from concepts according to principles, which reason has been using for a long time without first inquiring in what way and by what right it has obtained them. So we were doing all that work, trying to kind of speculate the way Descartes did and so on, but without questioning all that stuff. Remember Descartes. Descartes was starting from doubting everything, and then what did he do? He started introducing those concepts, including that the cause has to be greater than effect. Where did he get that from? What is that? What is it based on? This is the question. It would be a dogmatic approach to simply say, well, it's common sense. What common sense? Is there any foundation to this common sense? That is the point of the critique. So, without any kind of self-criticism, without looking at your own capacity to understand these things, you cannot do that. That would be a dogmatic approach. And critical philosophy, which is what Kant introduced, is an attempt to basically look at the reason itself and investigate how does it operate. So you can compare it to today we have a very good example with computers, right? Imagine that our mind is kind of like a computer. So we deal with the reality outside of us on a daily basis. But what is needed in this case, Kant thought, is to kind of turn around and look at ourselves. Look at our own mental software and see how does it work. How does it operate? According to what rules? Are there any rules? Can we figure them out? And that can help us to understand what can we know, what can we not know, and how can we know that. So this is the idea behind critique of pure reason. That's why it's called critique of pure reason. The pure reason itself has been subject to this critique. The pure reason being that mental software we have in our head. And it has been put on this kind of observation as to figure out what exactly is it and how does it operate. First he had so-called A edition. He published it in 1781, and it was, like I said, kind of misunderstood. People did not get it very well. So then he came up with the work I let you guys read, which is kind of prolegomena to any future metaphysic, where he is trying to explain the same things in a different way. And then he also redid the critique itself in 1787, 6 years after the first edition. Second edition came out. He removed some parts of it, he added some stuff, he edited it quite a bit, and it is essentially different work. So today when they actually publish it, they publish both versions because there's so many differences between them that in many ways you can only understand what he's talking about by reading both of them. Neither one of them exclusively gives you as good of an idea. Okay, so the goal there is again to set out legitimate claims of reason, filter out all the groundless claims. What can we really know about the world? Now that gets us to the Copernican revolution, which is most important part of it. Let me try to explain it to you. I will need to use the board, and hopefully you will see what he means. Now just to remind you, again, the work of Locke, representative realism of Locke. This is kind of a departing point. So if you look at it this way, if this is our mind, and there are some objects in the world around us, let's say this is an object. Again, remember, representative realism of Locke was telling us that we get some sort of representation of this object into our head, and all we have access to is the representation of this object, but we're trying to figure out, based on this representation, what the object really is like. So the emphasis here is on the object. The object is there, and our mind is trying to understand it. Now Kant says his Copernican revolution is to switch the focus point from the object to the mind. What does he mean? He means that our mind plays an important role in the construction of object. The object is not just given to us. The way we understand it, our mind does certain work too. He says you can think of it in this way. Object provides a matter of experience, but our mind provides a form of experience, which is kind of like our mental software, something our mind works on. And that includes, first of all, the concepts of space and time. He calls them intuitions. This is how our mind understands reality in space and time. Everything outside of our mind, all the bodies, have to exist in space. Everything inside takes place in time. So both of them are part of our mental software, and therefore, and this is kind of an interesting, maybe most interesting part of it, therefore they are not fully real. They are something our mind adds to the reality outside of us as one of the conditions of being able to experience it. How are the objects in themselves? What he calls thing in itself. Thing in itself, which means the same object, but without the contribution of our mind. Well, Kant tells us we don't know, and we can never know, because we cannot go outside our mind. We cannot experience any object outside of space and time. Try to think of anything without space and time being involved whatsoever. Not only that, but he's saying another feature of our mind is all the categories which we are using. The categories is something our understanding uses. And that includes cause and effect, and that also includes substance. So both substance and cause and effect are part of our mental software on which our brain is essentially operates. We cannot understand reality around us without applying cause and effect and without applying the idea of a substance. So when we see, for example, a marker, we think of it as a marker as one thing because that's how our mind perceives objects. It takes them in particular space, and within a certain period of time it thinks about them as a one entity, in this case a marker or an apple or another object. It just puts together this kind of experiences which we have into a unity, and this is how it is set up to operate. It's just the only way we can perceive stuff. So that's one of the most important things in Kant. Okay, so you were asking about what doesn't exist. What doesn't exist? Note that there are two parts to that involved. Object does exist as something. It just doesn't exist as what we perceive it as. Object without our contribution, our mind, is a thing in itself. It is there, all right. It's just where. It's not in space and it's not in time. Now you can't imagine anything outside of space and time. And for this reason you cannot understand it outside of space and time. But it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Note that this is an important difference with Berkeley in particular. It exists, all right. You just cannot access it without using your mental software. So when you think about it as computer again, right? Each computer has software, right? This is how computers run. If you don't have software in a computer, it won't be able to do anything. But if you have software there, it will only be able to do these particular operations which software allows to do. And if you take, for example, an old computer from the 90s and try to get it to do some of this modern stuff, like install something modern, it simply won't be able to do that because it doesn't have the capacity. Same thing with our brain. It has a particular capacity, it runs on a particular software, and that's all it can do. That doesn't mean there is no reality outside of us. It just means that the way we perceive it is kind of warped. It is already constructed by our own mind. That's the idea behind Kant's philosophy. So objects essentially conform to our cognition. They have to, otherwise we would not be able to understand them. All this stuff which Hume is talking about, it really is kind of a necessary part of the experience, except that this is the part of experience which our mind contributes. And not because we are making it up, but because it's kind of like pre-installed software on which we operate. So that's the idea again of Copernican revolution, to switch it towards the mind, from the object towards the mind, and to understand that our mind is necessarily part of the process. You cannot think of objects as existing completely outside, completely independent of the mind, because there's just no capacity for us to do that. Okay, and that kind of brings us to all his explanation. One of the way to think about it could be like a cookie press example. Think about it this way. Reality provides the cookie dough. but the cookie dough by itself is nothing yet, right? And our mind works like a cookie press. It presses this dough into particular cookies according to its own shape. That's how it works. It's kind of a two-way street. Okay, so think about this. Well, this is like the reading when he goes into explanation of his project. It may seem a little bit confusing, but let's try to understand when he talks about a priori, a posteriori, and analytic and synthetic. So look at these two statements. All bachelors are unmarried. Is it true or false? True. And note that it has to be true. There is no way for it not to be true. Why? Because bachelors by definition are unmarried. You cannot have a married bachelor. That would be just nonsense. Like 2 + 2 = 5. So that is rather clear. But how do we know that? Do we have to do any kind of measurement or anything to understand that? Not really, right? You can do this entire thing in your head. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now look at this other statement. All bachelors in this class are 6 feet tall. Note the difference. Well, hold on, Julia. Do you know it for a fact? Is that because you know any bachelors who are not 6 feet tall? Note that the girl is actually called bachelorette, right? Bachelor would be male. So how would you ever know if that's true or false? Yeah, but how would we know for sure? We get a measurement. Exactly. Unlike the first one, you cannot do it in your head. You actually have to do something to go out into the real world and do this work in order to understand it. So this is what he talks about in terms of, first of all, a priori, a posteriori. The first statement would give us knowledge a priori, meaning prior to experience. We don't have to do the experience of knowing that bachelors are unmarried. We don't have to do anything. We can do it all in our head, a priori. Second one, a posteriori, meaning we can only know whether it's true or false, posterior or after the experience. First we have to do the experiment of measuring those bachelors. And then we can finally say whether it's true or false. It is unlikely, like you said, that's true. But unless you do that, you may be surprised. Who knows? Maybe like we have very tall people in this class. Maybe it just so happens that all of them are over 6 feet tall, right? Until you measure them, you cannot be sure. You can say, well, it's unlikely, but you cannot be sure. After you do, though, you will definitely know that for a fact. Well, like I said, you are a bachelorette, right? So you're not a bachelor. Bachelor would have to be male. Okay, anyway. But the point is not about whether or not we have bachelors. The point is about how you find out whether something is true or not. You can take any other example you want. So, he talks about a priori and posteriori based on experience, and then he also says that there are varieties of judgments which are analytic and synthetic. And the difference between them, an analytic judgment, you don't have to go outside the concept to understand, to figure it out. And in synthetic judgment, you do need to put two concepts together. So it's kind of like this. All bachelors are unmarried, again, would be analytic, because the concept of bachelor kind of has this unmarried inside of it, right? It's like inside of this concept. If you kind of unpack it, you will figure out that it is unmarried. So he calls it judgment of clarification. Why? Because it doesn't give us any new knowledge, does it? You don't find out anything by knowing that bachelors are unmarried. It's like, well, duh. I mean, that just, the butter is buttery, or the oil is oily. It doesn't really give you anything new. So analytic judgments typically are the ones which don't give you anything new. That's why he calls them judgments of clarification. Synthetic judgments is the ones which give you something new. So all bachelors in class are 6 feet tall would be synthetic judgment. If you actually find that out, your knowledge increased. Now you know something new, something surprising. That turns out in this class, all bachelors are at least 6 feet tall. Wow. That is not something you can just figure out by looking at the term bachelor, right? So for this reason, he calls them judgments of amplification. So they kind of amplify your knowledge. They multiply it, make it bigger. Now, here is what he is getting at. He says that if you put these two together, you can get 4 combinations, right? A priori, a posteriori, analytic, and synthetic. So he's saying there are 4 types, 4 kinds of judgments we can have. One of them is analytic a priori. That would be, again, all bodies are extended, because you can do everything there analytically, and it is a priori because it's kind of like already in your head. As soon as you know the concept of a body, you know it is extended, because there is no body other than the ones which has some measurement. If it doesn't have any measurement, then it's not a body. Okay, now can you imagine analytic a posteriori? No, because if it's a posteriori, if you get it from experience, that cannot be analytic. It can only be synthetic, meaning you would need to put some concepts together. In particular, this ball is falling, so you take a concept of a ball, you take a concept of falling, and only after you actually experience the fact that the ball is falling, you can put them together and say, this ball is falling. Okay, so that would be synthetic a posteriori. Now, is it possible to have a fourth kind? Which kind is left, by the way? Can you see that? Synthetic a priori, exactly. Why is it important? Because note that a posteriori gives us new knowledge, but it gives us new knowledge when we actually have experience, when we observe it, such as we look at the bachelors in this class, we figure out they're 6 feet tall. A priori supposed to give us knowledge without the experience. Analytic a priori though doesn't, because just investigating the concept itself doesn't give us anything new. But synthetic a priori would be the kind of judgment which you do completely in your head, but it gives you some sort of new knowledge. It's not as battery. It actually gives you some knowledge. Is that possible? Note that Hume would tell you no, it's impossible, because he's empiricist, right? So he would tell you, of course you cannot get knowledge straight from your head. Everything comes from experience. Hello? But Kant actually disagrees with him. He says, no, there are such judgments. Yeah, so can you figure out a type of judgment which would be synthetic a priori? He gives an example of that. And it's a pretty good example, actually. If you think about it, the very clear area where we do that all the time is what? Mathematics. Math. Math is an example. Because math, okay, if you look at something like 5 plus 7 equal 12, his example, by the way, some people can say, well, that comes from experience. But look at, for example, something like that. Can we calculate that? Root of 100 plus 5 squared minus root of 15. Well, we can, but do we get that from experience? Do you ever experience something like this? No. The only way to figure something like this out is in your head. That's the only way. And that actually gives you new knowledge, doesn't it? That's how math works. You can do stuff, you can learn new stuff by not leaving the chair. You're sitting in a chair all day, you're thinking, you're doing math in your head, and you're actually learning new things. So that's the idea, he says, so it is possible. And that is the type of synthetic a priori. And he says there are several other things like that. He says geometry. Straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. That is, again, he says, something which you can figure out based on your knowledge of straight line and distance between 2 points. But it's not like bachelors are unmarried, because that actually is something you have to integrate your knowledge of space. And so that is an extension of knowledge based on not so much experience, but you thinking about whatever concepts you have and putting them together in a new way. But more importantly, he says all events have a cause. The famous causality of Hume is also like that. That is synthetic a priori. That is something which Hume couldn't figure out. And he says that is the type of knowledge which we do have, and it is based on a priori, based on not on what we see around us, but based on our head, based on our understanding of how things work. So this is the type of judgments he dedicates the entire work to, synthetic a priori judgments, the ones which add something to our knowledge, and yet we do not get them from experience. You cannot experience this stuff. Mathematics is like that, and geometry is like that, and some other things. So how are they possible? That's the big question of the critique. How is it possible that we actually do discover this kind of knowledge within our head? And his answer is rather simple, really, because it's in our head to begin with. This is part of our mental software. And so when we discover it in our head, all we do is we actually discover the rules of our own mind, the software we are running on. That's what happens. All these laws of nature, including the law of causality, is part of that mental software. So that is the idea in one sentence, I would say. The transcendental method which he applies in Critique of Pure Reason is to try to kind of get outside the box and to say, okay, we have experience. We see things follow particular rules. Let's try to get outside the box and say what would be necessary for us in order to have experience the way we do. What exactly is that kind of mental software which would be required in order for it to work in this particular way. It's kind of like, you have a computer in front of you and you don't exactly know how it works, so you start doing things on it and try to learn from that how does it work, and you ask yourself, why does it do things in this particular way? Well, perhaps the software there is set up in such a way that that's the only way it can do it. And you kind of learn about this software not from manual of some sort, but by doing what you do. We usually don't look at it this way, right? We don't try to figure out how does our mind work based on our daily operations. We cannot take it for granted. But this is what Kant is trying to do. He's trying to turn kind of around again in this Copernican way and look at ourselves and try to figure out how do we work. And so again, he is coming to the conclusion that space and time are part of our mental software. They are necessary in order for us to experience the world. They are, and this is important, not real in themselves. They are not transcendentally real. They are empirically real, but not transcendentally real. What does he mean by that? They are empirically real in a sense that everything we experience, the empiria, is always in space and time. And that is true. Everything we experience is in space and time. Space is the form of outer sense. Everything outside of us we experience in space. Time is a form of inner sense. Our mind works in time. It does not have spatial dimension, but it does have a dimension of time. So all our thoughts are extended in time. All our experiences are perceived in time. If we think about when did I have this thought? You can say exactly when, right? Yesterday at 5 p.m. I had a thought that perhaps I want to go to the beach. You cannot have a thought which would not be placed in time. That's impossible. So that's why, because that's part of the mental software. And in terms of space, he's saying, well, try this thought experiment. Try to remove objects around you one by one. So, like you're sitting in a chair right in front of the computer. There's no computer now. Okay, there's no wall. Then there's no table. There's no chair. There's no this. Remove everything. You just have this one empty, huge container of space. Well, is that conceivable? Can you do that? Well, yeah, it seems like something we can do. I mean, it's not easy, kind of. There may be some problems with it, but it's not logically impossible to do that. Now, try the other way. Try to remove the space, but imagine somehow objects. The objects are still there, but now there is no space. No, that is completely impossible. As soon as we remove the space, we remove the objects. That's what he's trying to say here. It's just not going to work. No way. Okay. So space and time, again, he's saying, are not real in transcendental sense. They are transcendentally ideal. So if you were able to go outside your mind and experience things in themselves, you would experience them without space and time. But of course you can't, because that would be like, telling a computer to do some operations without software. Try uninstalling all software from your computer, see if it will do anything. It will not do anything. It will be dead. And that's why, because you need to install software in order to operate. Same thing here. We can't. That's just part of our construction, that we have to experience everything in space and time. But by themselves, space and time are not real. That's the idea. Categories of our understanding, that's another thing which we are using in order to perceive objects, perceive the world around us. We apply the categories, and in particular, substance is one of those categories, and cause and effect, causality, that's another one. They are kind of another part of our mental software which we run on. If we did not do that, we would not experience world as this kind of coherent experience. We would not be able to make any sense out of it. There would be no meaning to it unless we actually use these categories of understanding. Now, he is saying that to neither of these powers, meaning the sensibility and understanding, to neither of these powers may a preference be given over the other. Without sensibility, no object could be given to us. If we didn't have any senses, there'd be no objects. But without understanding, no object would be thought. So, in order to have an object, you need to have a work of both of them. First, you have to have some sort of material of experience. Your eyes see the color, and your hands feel something, and so on. But, in addition to that, your mind has to put it together in a particular way and do some work on it in order to create this concept of a marker. And we constantly do that. It's kind of this background process. We have these pure concepts which are already there. He actually kind of puts these categories of understanding in a nice table there. That's later in the work. He didn't assign it as reading. Quality, quantity, relation, modality, and so on. There's no reason to understand all these details for this class, because if you are curious, if you want to read the Critique of Pure Reason, it is kind of complicated and he goes into great detail about it in the book. We're not going to go into detail, but the idea is this. He kind of tries to figure out the entire structure of our mental software. And this is how he answers Hume's skepticism, because remember, Hume was saying that we cannot have a priori knowledge because all we have is this flow of experiences, unrelated impressions of some sort. Now Kant says that's actually not the case at all. Sensations we have appear in consistent and permanent groups. So that's why we can recognize this marker, because we already had this group of experiences before, and our mind has put it together under the marker, something like this. And so now when we see it, and our visual sense tells us that it looks like, we immediately recognize it because we compare it to this previous experience, and we are saying, hey, marker, okay, apple, excellent, cup of tea, and so on. We don't even think about it, but this is this is the whole process. There's a lot involved in here. So the substance, the good old substance, according to Kant, is one of those concepts which our mind actually needs to apply. There's no such thing as an apple. There's no such thing as a marker. But we actually do put these experiences together in order to work with them. And that's what our mind needs to do. Otherwise, we will not be able to operate in our life. Same thing with causality. Again, our mind kind of needs to understand events as causally connected. Now, based on this entire division, can you now see how you can reconcile this causality with freedom? Can you figure it out? We will talk a little bit more about this next time, but can you already kind of see where it's heading? Okay, but yeah, can you figure out how does he explain it? Think about that. So is there a such thing as freedom? Why do we not see it? Why do we see everything as causally connected? Every event has a cause. Well, suppose you're wondering whether you should eat an ice cream. Now, if there is no freedom, then you really are fooling yourself. It's already determined that you will eat this ice cream. You have no choice whatsoever. It's been decided for you by the laws of physics. But somehow, every time we experience something like this, don't you actually feel that it can go either way? I can eat it or not eat it. Nothing really determines me. So how do you specifically reconcile that? Well, it should. Why doesn't it? How does physics allow for freedom of the will? Okay, well, your mind is physical, isn't it? Well, physics doesn't do anything. Physics just explains how it works. But it explains how it works by using the law of cause and effect. Everything is causally connected. For example, if this marker falls, why does it happen? Well, because I let go of it, so there's some physical movement, right? My fingers splitting apart, and then the law of gravity starts moving on it. Now, if you look back in this chain at why did I let it go? Well, because I decided to do so. But that seems to have no cause. Does it? No, gravity starts working only after I let it go. Why do I let it go? Do I have a choice here? Well, okay, so then do I have a choice or not? What you're saying is I could not let it go? It's completely determined? But how does it make any sense? I mean, think about it in physical terms. There's a physical process going on in my brain. That process is following the laws of physics, and it is causally connected to previous processes in my brain throughout my entire life. To say that I have a freedom of the choice is just to say that somehow it escapes this physical causality. It happens on some different level, whatever that level may be. But again, from the point of view of physics, you shouldn't be able to. Well, but know that you cannot prove that, and you cannot explain why. I mean, you're saying yes, but how can you prove that? No, okay, but that's not going to prove anything, because I can tell you, yeah, it was determined that you will leave. You just followed that program. You think you made a free choice, but you didn't. You were already determined to leave. So you didn't prove anything to anybody. Well, I guess Julia has left, but like I said, it doesn't prove anything. You just misunderstand the problem then. Because doing something is not proving that you had a choice not to do that. The only way to prove that you had a choice not to do that is to do and not do it in the same time. And you can't do that. So if you were able to stay in this lecture and leave it in the same time, then you could show me that you can do either one. But otherwise you cannot. Or to leave it twice and in different life to do a different choice. But the choices you're doing in this life are not proving that you have a choice. They're just proving that you are doing stuff. And of course you're doing stuff. You don't have any choice but not to do stuff. So that proves nothing. Sorry. Okay. Well, Kant does kind of explain it now. And this is how he explains it. He says that here, the way we understand the world, everything is causally connected. Cause and effect. So, the way we perceive the world and perceive all the objects always have to follow that. But the way things are in themselves, that's where freedom is. It's in this part. This is the world which we cannot access, but like somehow know what we're there. Why? Because I guess our mind, our ego, our real self is part of this world in itself. However, we actually cannot experience it because it's not part of the experience. It cannot be in space and time. So this is kind of the beauty of his explanation. On one hand, yes, he's saying there is cause and effect. There is cause and effect. Everything we experience around us follows the laws of causality. But, in the same time, there is freedom. It's just that it's not part of the world as we experience it through our senses. So, according to Hume, to say every lemon has a sour taste and to say every event has a cause is essentially same type of statements. Essentially what he's saying is that the fact that every event has a cause is simply a result of our experience. Just like why do we know that every lemon has a sour taste? Well, we tasted a bunch of lemons. All of them had sour taste. So then we say all of them should have sour taste. But Kant says no, there's difference there. And the difference is every event has a cause, also has this type of necessity in our mental software. Looks like Julia is not even coming back. I mean, that is funny that she spent all this effort to do that, and she didn't prove anything at all. If she did come back, I hope she does kind of read it later or watch it later and sees that that was completely pointless exercise. No, she said I can leave now, and she said I'm leaving now, and that's my freedom of the will. Which of course does not prove that, does it? Because like I said, well, I can just say you were determined to leave, so of course you left. It was already there, written in the great book of destiny. How did you prove that you had freedom of the will by doing that? It's just pointless. Anyway. So substance and causality are both empirically real. They are real in this empirical world, but they are transcendentally ideal. So if we could experience the world outside of our software, outside of the way we perceive it, we would understand that there is none of this. And it gives us a lot of interesting opportunity in terms of like how we can understand what is going on. Okay, so do you think Kant's theory has effectively answered Hume's skepticism? First of all, yes or no? Let's do the poll here. Do you think Kant has addressed it well? Did he actually answer that? Okay. Well, Andy, do you want to vote or you're browsing Facebook? Okay, I guess not. 5 people think so and 1 person does not. So why or why not? Can anybody elaborate on that? Why do you think he did answer it, or why do you think he did not? Oh, Julia, you're back. I was just saying that you did not prove anything at all with your example, because I can just say now that it was completely determined that you would leave, and so you just did what you were supposed to do. What did it prove? How does it possibly prove that you had a choice? It does not. It just proved that you really had to choose between staying and going away, which, well, that's common sense, isn't it? You really can't do both at the same time. Or maybe you just think so. I mean, when I drop this marker and it falls on this side, I can say, oh look, it had a choice. It could have fallen on the other side, but it decided to fall on this side. But wouldn't you agree that this is just stupid? Because of course it was determined that it will fall on this side, and it never had any other choice. It's just that if it was marker could have told you I have a choice, but we know it doesn't. Well, you can say there's specific mental formula which determined the fact that you would leave. Based on your character, based on your previous experiences, based on your mental structure, you were determined to leave. In order for you to prove that you had a choice, the only way you could do that is if you go back in time, do it again, and this time don't leave. Can you do that? Okay, well, I'm waiting for you to go back 15 minutes ago and repeat the entire thing. I mean, you can't do it now, because we already are in different time. That's already gone. It's no longer available. Yeah, it is impossible, isn't it? So you really can't prove that then. You made a choice which you made, but to prove to me now that it was a free choice, you really have to do it again differently back then, not right now. Because I mean, obviously right now you can do it differently, but back then you couldn't. That's what I'm claiming. Anyway, like that is the problem, and I don't know if you saw that part, but Kant is actually trying to answer that, and we just talked about how he's trying to answer that. He's saying that the world as we experience it does follow cause and effect, but the world in itself, the one where the thing in itself is, that's where the freedom is. We cannot perceive the world around us without applying cause and effect, but somewhere deep inside, we do have access to this other reality, which is what our real self is part of, which is why it feels to us like we actually do have a choice when we can't prove that, because everything we do in this world always follows this cause and effect kind of structure. That's the only way we perceive it. So that's why you may actually understand yourself that you have freedom, but you cannot explain it to me and you cannot prove it to me. Just like same thing with me. I know on some deep level that I have freedom, but I cannot prove it to you because everything you see me doing is just following this cause and effect kind of laws. That's the only way you can experience that. Let me put it like this way. Suppose you were the only human being in this planet and everybody around you would be robots. And those robots would be following their programs. How could you ever know that they don't have freedom? No, but you see what I'm talking about? You can see that you are the one who making free choices. How can you see that other people are making free choices? You don't know that. For all you know, they may be just these programs which just follow their program. But that's why, because you cannot experience outside world other than within this framework of cause and effect. One thing causing the other thing and following the strict necessity. Okay. Well, anyway, he is talking about more specifically, gives an example how our mind does this type of synthesizing activity. He gives an example of music. Suppose you hear the music. He's saying what happens in our brain is this. First of all, the synthesis of apprehension and intuition. We separate the sounds of music from other sounds. There could be like, say you are sitting in your car, right? The noise of the car, the noise outside the window, and so on. But your mind somehow picks out the sounds of music, doesn't it? And recognizes it and says, ooh, it's music. Then, synthesis of reproduction and imagination. That's another process. What it means is, note that the music does not happen all at once, does it? It takes kind of time. You hear one note, the other note, the other note, and yet your mind perceives it as one thing. It doesn't just hear the bang, gong, dang. It has this whole melody. And that's work of your mind. Your mind puts it together in this way. And finally, a synthesis of recognition in a concept. You are saying to yourself, it's Beethoven. Based on what? Well, you have this concept of Beethoven's music, and your mind kind of compares what you hear with that concept. And if they kind of click, your mind says, that's Beethoven. This is the process which takes place all the time with all the objects, including like the markers and so on. And your mind kind of constantly does that and applies all these parts of it. It just happens so quickly that you don't really realize that and don't really think about that. So in that sense, all the objects do conform to the mind, because otherwise your mind would never be able to perceive them. Okay, we will go further into Kant next time and talk also about some of the conclusions, important conclusions he draws from all this stuff, because he does have some interesting insight into how we should live based on that, how we should build our life, relations with other people and so on, which is, I guess, the most important part, because otherwise you can say, yeah, this is all cute, but what does it give me? And this is what it should give you. It should give you an idea of how to organize your life, so that you would actually be able to take advantage of this knowledge. Okay? And we will talk about it next time. And we'll talk about the essay too. And that's pretty much all we have for today. Out of time now, so I'll see you then, guys, and I will put up the video this time because I finally have my software working and I'm able to make the video out of the lecture. Okay, so I will see you on Wednesday, and have a good elections day experience. Hopefully we will still be in one piece by Wednesday.